Good morning, everybody. It seems fitting on this day where we mark the end of my story within the larger story of Good Sam, that our gospel presents its own story within a story. This story starts with the frantic pleading of a little girl's father, Jairus, who we are told is the leader of the local synagogue. Jairus comes to Jesus, begging him to come and heal his daughter, who is sick to the point of death. And Jesus agrees, walking into the crowded streets of the town to go with Jairus to his house. It's only for this reason that Jesus enters the town at all. Until this point, we've heard in these last few weeks of stories from Mark's gospel, Jesus has been mostly keeping his distance from residential, highly populated areas. He has, for the most part, been crisscrossing the Sea of Galilee, preaching on the shores of the sea, or healing people up in the mountains, away from the towns. But on this day, Jairus' request draws him into the middle of the town. And in the story, we can see why he has been keeping his distance. It's because he was, as you can imagine, pretty popular amongst the people. Word of Jesus' teachings and healings had gotten around in this small region surrounding the Sea of Galilee, and the crowds, though manageable from a boat or on the side of a mountain, became quite overwhelming in the close confines of a local town or village. And so we hear in this account that as Jesus entered the town, the crowd pressed in upon him. The author of the gospel makes it clear that Jesus is wading through a tightly packed crowd of people, all pressing in on him to try and get as close as possible. And so it is here that the second story within this story emerges. This woman who had been bleeding for 12 years, which in this context means that she had had a constant flow of blood due to menstruation for that long, takes advantage of this opportunity to push through the crowd and touch Jesus' clothing in order to be healed. Up until this point, it was really hard to get close enough to Jesus to touch him, most likely, especially if you were hoping to be discreet about it. But this scene created the perfect opportunity for this woman, who had spent every dime of her money and every ounce of energy to get better, but only ever got worse, to reach out with one last gasp for healing. And not just physical healing, but emotional and spiritual and relational healing as well. Because of the religious laws of her and Jesus' Jewish community at this time, women were considered ritually unclean for the time that they were menstruating and for some days after. But this woman had been menstruating for 12 years, meaning that she'd been ritually unclean for that long as well. This meant that in many ways she was cut off from the practices and rituals and relationships of her community. She was not allowed to fully participate in the only community she had. So to be healed of this flow of blood would not just make her body whole, it would make her community whole again. It would make her relationships whole. And so, believing in the miraculous healing stories she had heard about Jesus, she wound her way through the crowd, knowing that if she could just touch even the smallest piece of his clothing, she would be healed. I can imagine her kind of ducked down close to the ground, hoping against hope that this would work and that she would not be seen touching the rabbi, which she would have also not been allowed to do in her physical state. And as she approaches Jesus and reaches out her hand, she touches just the frayed edge of his cloak and instantly feels the change in her body. The cramping she has felt for 12 years is gone. The soreness in her lower back vanishes. She can tell that her bleeding has stopped. In amazement, she must have stood there, stuck to the ground like a statue, until she remembered where she was and what she was doing, and with unbridled joy springing forth from her every fiber, slowly started backing away from Jesus, hoping that no one saw her hand reach out from under the cloak for the mere seconds it took her to touch him. And then she hears the voice of the rabbi, as he turns to where she had just been standing, ask in a calm but clear voice, "Who touched my clothes?" Dread must have slowly washed over her body as she hears those standing next to him respond, "You see the crowd pressing in on you. How can you say, 'Who touched me?'" And as she watches Jesus slowly scanning the crowd, another wave of fear crashes over her as she sees the face of the man standing beside him, Jairus, the leader of the synagogue, the one who for 12 years has told her that she cannot take part in the life of this community, the one who sent her to doctor after doctor for treatment, the one who, if she is found out, will have the power to ostracize her even further for touching the rabbi. And then the strangest thing happens. As her gaze moves from Jairus back to Jesus, something else grows in her that begins to overtake the dread and fear, something light and earthy and grounding, something that tells her, "Do not run. Tell them the truth. You have been running, hiding, fleeing for too long. You are healed. Tell them what has taken place here, regardless of the outcome." And as this feeling swells in her chest, she realizes that Jesus is staring right at her. And then the crowd is parting, and suddenly she is on the ground, not in defeat or in pain, but in gratitude, still with fear and trembling, but now mixed with hope and strength. And as she tells Jesus the whole truth of what has happened, the endless doctors, the worsening of her condition, the money she spent, the relationship she's missed out on, she finally relays the events of that day and says to him, "When I saw you enter the town, I knew that this was my chance to be healed. I have heard all the miraculous things that you have done, and I knew that if I just touched the hem of your cloak, I would be healed. And so I did, and it worked, Jesus. It worked. Touching your cloak has made me well." And Jesus, gazing into her eyes, takes a deep breath and shakes his head ever so slightly and says in that same calm but clear voice, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." And as he turns back to the awaiting crowd, she sees Jairus' face again, and instead of the look of disapproval or anger she was expecting, she sees tears in his eyes and a small smile on his face before the crowd closes in and he is swept away from the scene. And as she walks away, life changed, body healed, relationships restored, the last thing she hears is a loud voice saying, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" And for a moment, her heart breaks for Jairus, for the man that had reinforced the barriers keeping her from inclusion in her community, now receiving this terrible news that his daughter is gone. But before she could even turn around to see what might play out next, she hears the calm but clear voice of the rabbi again. "Do not fear, only believe." And she knows that his daughter will be all right, and that he will be all right, and that she will be all right. And so the story goes on, with each of them going their separate ways. We know that Jesus goes on to live out his ministry in Galilee and eventually Jerusalem. But what happens to this woman? What happens to Jairus? What happens to the players in the story within a story? It is at this mysterious, uncertain inflection point that we find ourselves today. Today is my final Sunday at Good Sam, and this is my final sermon. And so we wonder today, what will happen next once we go our separate ways? Just like Jairus and this woman, we have become part of each other's stories. And while you might say we have very little in common with these two characters, if we think about it for a moment, our similarities might emerge. We do know now what it feels like to be isolated from our community. Maybe not for 12 years, but for a year and a half. Maybe some of us know what it feels like to be excluded from community for things we cannot control, for something we are told makes us unclean or lesser than. Maybe we are the ones with the power, reinforcing either consciously or unconsciously the barriers to inclusion and full participation in the lives of the various communities to which we belong. At the very least, we have all seen in these last 2 years together how racism has worked and continues to work in our country, in our communities, to create invisible barriers and sometimes visible barriers to full inclusion and access for people of color, whether explicitly through laws and policies or through the ideology of racism that works to keep us separated from one another in all we do. But like these two characters, we have been transformed in our time together. We have been affected by one another. And that is not just about my story within this Good Sam story, but the stories we all bring to this community. And on an even larger scale, the stories of ourselves and our communities that we bring to God's story of love and healing and justice that has been unfolding since long before we got here and will continue long after we are gone. So we take time today to remember the last 2 years of our time together. And as we do so, I hope that we let it bring up in us the gratitude for what has been, as well as the energy to propel us forward to transform this community and the world. Let us remember the powerful witness of sacred ground that so many of us have been changed by over these last 2 years. Let us remember the pain of what it feels like to be isolated from one another, and the suffering that comes when we don't have access to the physical, emotional, and spiritual resources we need. Let us remember Brianna and Ahmad and George and Adam and the countless people who have died as a result of systemic injustice and racism. Let us remember the frustration and challenge of the 2020 election and the disconnect that our differences can make us feel when we do not listen to one another. Let's remember the joy of returning to this place, to each other's sides, the hope of a vaccine, the excitement of reconnection. And as we remember it all, let us move into this mysterious, uncertain, unknown future, changed by all of it, transformed by one another in the world, reshaped by the stories we have come into contact with, the stories that our story is now a part of. Because maybe, just maybe, it was seeing the woman healed in the streets by her own faith that gave Jairus enough faith to believe that his daughter could be healed too. Maybe this woman's faith in her own healing sparked a chain reaction of healing that we are still feeling today. Maybe we have given each other a depth of faith that will carry us into the future. And so we ask ourselves, how will we go forward from this day? Carrying on this tidal wave of healing and justice and love into the world and change the story forever.